Does anyone know? Is there like an event or something happening? Because I feel like the university as a whole is just empty today. I was walking around, it was just empty hall after empty hall after empty hall. It was kind of spooky to go through like the underground and have no one there. No? Okay. Um, all right, well,
Just
yeah,
deriving substitute retro writing, right?
okay.
So many people get up retro to take another transportation.
Yeah, that's possible. Yeah, that's every time as the winter arrives, like the no, kind of stop talking. It's fine. Like the transportation system kind of, or as the winter ends, sorry, I should say, the transportation system kind of screws over. That might be it. It might also just be because it's the end of the semester and people are just tired. It's fine. Okay. Did we all, at least for those of you who are here, did we all finish Kraken? Or enough of it? I know you finished it, Minky. Carlos, you're nodding yes. Yeah. Liam, how about you? Yes, no, enough. Okay, good. um, so we're going to cover it a little bit today, and some of the stuff that we covered, we kind of alluded to last week, right? When we talked a little bit about Mieville's own personal politics, right? We mentioned that Mieville himself is a socialist, right? He ran for the for a socialist party, I should say, in his own country of Great Britain. And we also talked about how Mieville tends to play with the politics of his books, right? Quite consciously, as someone who thinks that, well, because politics is just a normal part of the world, it kind of makes sense to also include it in the books that we write, right? Whether or not the author agrees with the politics that they're actually playing with is kind of secondary to the point, right? You're nevertheless playing with it. So, in line with that, or perhaps as an extension of this, for this week, our more theoretical component is, as is indicated here on the PowerPoint, right, a Marxist analysis of Kraken. Now, there's something I should mention right at the start. I'm not necessarily doing a Marxist analysis, or I'm not encouraging a Marxist analysis purely because of Mieville's own politics, right? Like, it is a happy coincidence that we're doing it at this stage and that Mieville is also someone with those persuasions politically. But as we'll see, Marxist analysis is something that has a rather long tradition in literary theory, and is something that can be applied to all kinds of works of literature. It's just that for this work in particular, we might have a bit of an easier time to see how that functions because of Mieville's own politics. But there are, for example, Marxist. You can have a Marxist analysis of, pretty much any piece of literature. Well, maybe not any, but there are plenty of options that you can choose from. But I am curious, and this is a question that I've asked before in the class, but I kind of stopped asking it, and now I'll ask it again, in part because of the implications of the term, right, Marxist. What do we think of, right, when we hear that term? Young people in the 21st century hearing this term, what comes to mind, right? Whether it's related to literature or not, right? I am curious if anything does. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Lee.
Communism?
Yeah, communism. Okay. Do you mean just as as an idea or as an actual political system that was put into place? Same one.
Political?
Mm-hmm.
Because government was one of the founder of the communism.
Yeah, or at least enough in the contemporary sense, right? You can see germs of the ideas of what we now call communism much before Karl Marx, right? If we take the British context that Mieville is writing in, about 200 years before Marx, there were revolutions that were happening, right? Namely, if you want to look into that history, groups that were called the levelers, right? And you kind of get that implication in the name, right? Leveling certain aspects of society, not in the sense of like everyone should be the same, right? That's not what they meant, but more in the sense of tearing down the major divides that were already forming by the 16th century when this group would have emerged, right? So you do see germs of that, but I think you're absolutely right, Liam, that when we think of that political idea today, right, of communism, we do heavily associate it with Karl Marx. By far, he's the one who popularized it, right? To the point where when I say the manifesto, right, I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about, right? You can nod yes or no if you know what I'm talking about. Who here knows what I'm talking about if I say the manifesto? No? The Communist Manifesto? No? Really? Okay. Now, you've never even heard the name? Seriously? I'm shocked. That's fine. I'm just genuinely surprised, right? Maybe it's just because it's the type of stuff that I tend to be interested in, right? This kinds of literary history. But yeah, like there have been hundreds of manifestos, right, written throughout history. There still are some that are written, and typically, right, maybe not in this classroom, but I have the sense that if you do say the manifesto, that's kind of what comes to mind for a lot of people, right? Despite the fact that there have been hundreds of productions that have been called or have the term affixed of manifesto, which in itself does indicate just how much influence it has had, right? For good or bad. Okay. What else? So communism is one of them. What else do we think of if we think Marxism? Or maybe we can elaborate. What do we think of when we think communism? Right? Perhaps that might be another path to follow. If in case it's not clear, because we're so few in class today, I'm just going to make this more of a discussion-based class, right? Well, so feel free to just kind of pop in whenever you feel comfortable. It's really, we'll make it a little bit more informal as a discussion today. So what else do we think of?
I think some division between ideologies, capitalism and communism, and some people in riots just imitate. I think I guess Marx cause a turning point in division. I just think.
So that's I think a very good point, right? Generally, we tend, still today in the 21st century, to get in close, Adam. Usually you sit over there in the middle, get in close. We're making a more informal discussion today. So we tend to think of this idea, right, of Marxism or communism as being opposed to the system that we have in place today in places like Canada or the United States, right, or actually pretty much everywhere in the world, right, which is a capitalist system. Okay. What else? We'll come back to that. What else do we think of? Hi.
I blame the metro.
Oh, there you go. That's what we were talking about. Is the metro? It shut down a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay.
And because I don't trust them to they say it would come back 12:05.
Yeah.
But I never trust them because every last time they told us they pushed it back further.
Yeah.
So I took the long way around.
Yeah. So I'm lucky for when I need to come to the university. I only need to take the blue line down like four stops. Right. I live at Jean Talon Station, Gastino Station, so it kind of goes pretty well. But yeah, I was in the metro shut down for like an hour and a half once. And it was like a break where they wouldn't like open the doors or anything like that. It was just the worst situation ever. It was terrible. Anyway. So anyway, coming back. So communism opposed to capitalism. Anything else? Do we think of any are there any countries that have tried this system in any way, shape, or form? Are there still countries? Are there still movements with this? Marxism. That's our literary analysis today. This is actually pretty interesting. Did you have your hand up or you were just okay. This is actually kind of interesting because there was a major country that existed not that long ago that officially had this as its official ideology, none of you were born.
Oh, USSR.
The USSR, right? But it is interesting how, historically speaking, it wasn't that long ago, right? In the grand scheme of history, the USSR collapsed or was dismantled in 1991, right? It started to kind of fall apart before that, Berlin Wall and all of that kind of falling in the late 80s, but it truly stopped being an entity in the early 90s, right? Like your parents, again, would have been alive. Maybe you have an older brother or an older sister that would have been alive at that time. I don't know. But, this, just to say that, like, not that long ago in the history of humanity, there were still, good morning. Oh, I'm glad. Okay, so maybe I forced you all to get close before a bit preemptively. But not too long ago in the history of humanity, we did have, genuine, if problematic, attempts to actually enable this type of anti-capitalist system, right? But of course, it's not just vague ideas, right? When we say communism specifically, as we've been talking about it, what do we imagine as to be like their basic premises, right, of that idea, right? What's the core value of this thing that we call Marxism or communism, which is technically two different things, by the way, as we'll kind of talk about. But for now, I'm just kind of talking about the two together, but we'll see that there are differences. Yeah.
Everyone in society working to get the same privileges, benefits, like all the things. Like everyone has, I guess, like, what's the word? Everyone is equal. It's like the general population would be completely equal.
In what sense? In every sense?
No, and well, like ideally it would be in every sense. Where it's like health wise, like money wise, like food wise, all of like even children wise, all that would be like ideally like equal. But of course that's impossible to do.
Okay, interesting. Anything else that we think of? So equality is one of them, right? People kind of being on the same footing. Again, we can kind of mitigate that idea. I don't think a lot of Marxists would necessarily say like everyone needs to be exactly the same, right? There's a bit to kind of mitigate with that, but the idea of like a more fair form of equality in society, I think definitely gets into that. What else? Yeah.
That socioeconomic structure as set form.
Okay, good. So against, again, this current socioeconomic system, right? Capitalism. What are some of the qualities that we associate with capitalism? I mean, qualities in like the aspects sense, not necessarily good or bad, but just what are some of the aspects of this socioeconomic system that you raise? Yeah.
Very competitive to like it's very competitive, or even boost competitism.
Yeah.
It's I guess it's all like everyone for themselves.
Yeah, it's much more individualistic.
Yeah.
I see. Okay, so much more competitive. Anything else? What do we think of? Does your shirt say live, laugh, lobotomy? Why? Okay. Sorry, that just struck out to me as like the weird thing. Okay.
It works.
It works. It does. Yeah. So again, it can be very difficult for us to kind of imagine what the system that we're actively living in, that all of you, right, have grown up in, without a doubt, right? And kind of like qualify it, because for a lot of us, it's just the way the world is, right? That's just how we exist, right? And this is where we kind of get into the more finer details of what we're talking about when we say a Marxist analysis, right? We tend to have specific ideas about what a Marxist analysis is. But at the end of the day, we can kind of bring it back to one of our early classes that we did on structuralism, right? Which, if you'll recall, was a way of kind of seeing the world in more general senses and trying to identify, right, what the individual scaffolds are of a piece of literature or a society or a government, right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? And Marxism in many ways is no different. The major point of departure that it will have, right, from other forms of structuralism, like, for example, psychoanalysis, which we've talked about, right, which tends to be a more structuralist type of criticism, where psychoanalysis takes the mind as its starting point. Marxism will take class division and labor, right, as its starting point. Okay, so you can kind of think of it along those lines, right? And this is where we were talking about when you were saying competition and more individualism. That is where it becomes relevant again. To a Marxist, the capitalist world that we all kind of live in is one in which we have an acute division between the owners of capital, right? So in Marx's time, for example, those would be, it wouldn't really be the monarchy anymore, that was already on its way out, but the factory owners, for example, right? If you imagine the Monopoly man from Monopoly, like that's who Marx is thinking of, the guy who owns all the property, okay? That's who we're thinking of. And the division between this person, right, usually a white man with a mustache, right, in the 19th century that Marx is writing in, and what Marx calls the proletariat. Who can tell me perhaps what the proletariat might be? If we're talking, yeah, what today we would call working class, right? In Marx's time, it was like it's not necessarily the same as we would imagine in 21st century Canada. It would have been very much the factory worker, maybe a little bit of the farmer, depends, right? An industrialized farmer might have been worked into the working class, right? Things like this. The actual people who labor, right, and provide work for a monopoly man capitalist, right? Now, why does this matter, right? Why is this important in any way, shape, or form? Okay. And I promise this actually does come down to literature at the end of the day. Like I'm setting up very quickly what this form of analysis is, but it does relate to literature. At the end of the day, right, this example of a capitalist who owns property, who owns the factory, who owns what Marx calls the means of production, right, the actual ways that things are produced, right? And the division between that person and the proletariat is one step in history, right? Which is why last week when I ended the class, I was like, you should maybe think about how history kind of functions and operates in this book. Because for a Marxist, and this is where like the famous quote comes from, the history of all societies is the history of class struggle, right? Which, for those of you who have not read the manifesto, comes from the manifesto in this case. It's a pithy line that identifies the manifesto. Hi, Aya, by the way, also, hello. So what we're getting at here, right, why this matters, is that when we say that, or at least when a Marxist will say that history is a series of class struggles, right, this is, again, a very structural way of understanding the world, right? And the current world that we live in under capitalism is just another ground in which those struggles can happen, right, between working class and property owner. Before that, in for example, the 14th and 15th century, it would have been the struggle between what we call now the bourgeois class, so merchants, and the dying aristocracy, kings, queens, and all of that, right? That would have been a class struggle that changed how history operated moving forward, right? Before that, right, you would have had, I don't know, hunter-gatherer societies, and eventually one hunter-gatherer decided to cordon off a piece of land, right, and say, well, that's mine now, right? I own this little piece of land where before it was just kind of all common property, right? That we all just kind of picked berries off of, or maybe hunted a mastodon. I don't know if historically that's quite accurate, but whatever, right? It's just an example here where suddenly this is mine, right? And we suddenly have this new class division, right? So if we want to imagine it in a kind of thing, the core idea, right, of any Marxist analysis is what we call a dialectic, right? Who here has heard that term before? No one? Yeah, okay, Sue, Francesca. Can either of you explain to me what that might be?
It's a dialectic. I'm not too sure for
Yeah.
dialect I can explain.
Okay, go ahead.
So dialect, basically, if someone speaks a certain language, it can be a slightly varied version of that same language.
Okay. It's not at all related to dialect, but you did the variant part you can kind of hold on to, right? The one adjective that you use. We'll kind of hold on to that. Francesca, do you have anything that you might want to add to that?
I think it's more like of a philosophical term, kind of like discussing opinions, arguments, types of vibe.
Yeah. Okay, good. So we'll hold on to the argument part. If we wanted to imagine it in a more how could I say visual term, right? To a Marxist analyst, right? We have a historical moment, right? Where, yeah, let's take feudalism, like I said before, where we have a king and the peasants working the land, right? So we have one class here, call him king or lord, right, depending on where you are. And another class, right? Which we'll call a peasant, right? So at one point in history, we had this kind of class division, right? And of course, some of you might already see some problems with this. This only applies to a very specific place in history at a very specific time, right? So that can already ring a few bells about certain people's criticisms of this form of history, right? This didn't necessarily apply to North America, for example, around that same time, right? Or it didn't necessarily apply to the Oceanic continent or any other places, right? So, this might be a more European-centered focus. But as we mentioned before, to a Marxist, we have a history of class conflict, right? So how history moves forward is that we have a conflict between these two classes, the lord and the peasants in this case, and it creates a variant on this class struggle. Right? Not that there is no more class struggle, right? But it's a new one that emerges from the conflict between those two classes that existed before. Okay? So in the example that I give here, what we have is the formation, right, of what we call the bourgeois class, right, in English. So early forms of merchants, for example. And the underclass, in this case, might be their employees, right? just to give an example, I'm sure some historians might disagree with me on how to qualify this exactly, but for the purposes of our example, it kind of works, right? Later, we'll have another conflict. Property owners emerge in the 19th century, what we call capitalists. In Marx's time, it's not necessarily a derogatory term, right? I mean, he means it derogatorily just because he doesn't like them, but he means it in the sense of the people who quite literally have the capital, right? They have money. They're the ones who have money as a form of investment, okay? And under them, the proletariat. To Marx, right, and to Marxist analysts, so this is kind of a normal part of the way that history flows, right? Societies change, people change, things change, that's fine, that's all normal, right? Where what Liam and others brought up earlier, right, is that for a Marxist, the next step after, right, is this communist horizon that we're talking about, right? The Marxists of the 19th and early 20th century imagined that in the current class struggle that they were writing in, right, what came after is a world in which the proletariat was the ruling class, right? And that's where kind of your idea, Adam, that you brought up earlier of a more equal society comes in, right? Since the proletariat form 99.9%, right, of society, if they're on top, most people are equal, right? Or there is a greater equality than there is in this form of system. Does this all make sense so far? This is like a super fast reading of this, of course, because I want to get to the literature part, but does this kind of track for people? Okay. Now, one of the ways that we kind of move from one idea or one form of society to another, right, is through what the branch that we're talking about today, right, we'll call materialism. And when we say materialism, I don't mean in like the Madonna song sense, we're living in a material world and I'm a material girl. That's not what we're talking about here, right? Madonna's a lot of things. I doubt she would be a Marxist, but although that would be a pretty banger thing to happen. Basically, in all of this class struggle, right, underlying all of it is this sense of materialism for a lot of Marxists. Does anyone want to take a shot at what this might mean? Or rather, instead of materialism, we might say material conditions. Adam and then Francesca.
I guess the sort of like obsession with the with like not just physical, but like having something like precious, having like something I guess you could value as like valuable and stuff like that.
Okay. So that would be the more contemporary term, I would say. That's not how we're understanding it here in the theoretical sense. But it's not an entirely wrong thing, it's just not the right place and time. Francesca, were you going to say the same thing?
So I was going to say like hoarding capital, but it's pretty similar.
So, capital can be a form of material condition in this sense. Where the bourgeoisie, for example, in our little sketch here, accumulated so much capital, right, that they were able to become the property-owning class. More than just merchants who bought and sold things, they actually owned what became the factory, right? So in a sense, that does kind of get at what the material condition is. Actually, no, I'm not going to write this down just because it would be too long to actually write down in its entirety, and I don't want to. In essence, right, what a Marxist critic will say is that history moves forward in part because of these class struggles, but these class struggles are only enabled based on what the actual material conditions are at the disposal of the people enacting those class struggles. Okay, so in a world in which king and lord is on top, right, in the feudal system, eventually enough peasants over time, right, are able to dissociate themselves from the king, right? They have their own plot of land, for example. And they have their own little funds, right? They have their side business, for example, where they can sell their own corn to whoever they want, or their own wheat to whoever they want. They don't have to sell it to the Lord anymore. They have enough where they can kind of do their own thing, right? So the actual material that they have access to, right, allows them to become merchants, right, with employees. And so on, right? And the conflict between that, like I said before, allows certain people to eventually gain so much capital as to become property owners, right? And now they actually have properties, right, or property that generates capital, their material conditions, what they have access to on their day-to-day life, changed to a point that society can now operate differently. This is, again, like a very surface level understanding of this. Okay? And I'm taking an economic perspective here because that's kind of the starting point for a lot of Marxist theory. But it also applies to, or has been applied to, all kinds of spheres of society. For example, what was the term? I wanted to use an example I was thinking of literally 5 seconds ago. Doesn't matter. I'll think of it at another point. But right, where we kind of get into the more literary aspect of it is that for a Marxist, this idea, right, of class struggle and material conditions influences more than one part of society, more than just the economy, right? Economy is one part of it. It is one driving force, but it is not the only driving force. And I just thought of my example again. That's all it took, was just thinking through it or talking through it. Another example that we can take, and that actually relates to this book, is religion, right? If we take a Marxist material analysis of religion, right, some people might say, okay, well, in the feudal times, right, in European feudalism, most people believed in God, right? Like, that's just a fact, right? Most people believed that there was a higher power, their name was God, and they had a son called Jesus Christ, and blah, 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 the whole 9 yards, right? And to a Marxist, they would say, it would be almost impossible at this time, right, in feudalism, for someone to come along and say, God doesn't exist, right? You technically could, right? Like, someone technically had the verbal capacity to do it. But to a Marxist analysis of history, they would say, it wouldn't really change much, right? Because the system, right, as a whole, society was organized in a way where it would be almost impossible to think otherwise, right? Your entire community was centered around the church, right? Everywhere you went, you had someone telling you that God existed, right? Most of your resources went to maintaining the church, right? And so every aspect around you would have been focused around this idea of Christianity at this time, okay, or at least that version that they understood it. And so on a material basis, it would have been super difficult for anyone to come along and say, no, the church does not exist, or the church exists, but God does not exist. It's all a scam, right? And you're believing in nothing at all, right? That person would have probably gotten killed, right? Or at least judged a heretic, and indeed some people, right? Fewer people than we actually think did get executed, but still, it was something that was punishable, right? So that's just one other example of how this kind of materialist understanding of history operates. Okay? Is it foolproof? No, right? There's plenty of ways that you can kind of poke holes into it. And I think anyone with more than 2 brain cells would say, yeah, I'm not looking to make a foolproof vision of history. It is one way of analyzing history among other forms of analyzing history, right? Or analyzing society. Okay. Okay. Does anyone have any questions so far or anything they want to kind of like add? This is kind of like, I've already spent more time on this than I actually expected to, so let's actually get into the literary part of it. Okay. Yeah. Just off the cuff here, everything that I've mentioned so far, how do we think this might fit into literature? Where does literature fit into this understanding of history, or someone saying that, history is class struggle and so on, right? Yes, Aya. Okay, so on the one hand, right, we can have people saying, yeah, the world that we live in, right, is maintained in part, or at least demonstrated in part, through books, right? Just to come back to that example, because you talked about it the last time you were in class, right? Heart of Darkness is a really good example of this, right? Where some people say that it's a book that maintains a kind of imperialist capitalist ideology in the way that it's written and in the way that it approaches its subject matter, right? Is that kind of what you're getting at? And if not, you can like disagree with me. It's fine. Okay, good. Any other ways that literature can fit into this? So on the one hand, it can absolutely maintain an ideology. Yeah.
It can be like, I guess, silently spread, or like subtly be like written in a text, whether it's about like it doesn't have to be about Marxism.
Yeah.
But it can have this like Marxist touch, I guess you could say.
Absolutely, right? Much like it can reinforce an ideology, it can also subvert it in many ways, right? Again, whether or not the author is consciously a communist or anything like that, that's kind of irrelevant, right? But they can have a different vision of society that they're advancing, and it's perpetuated through literature. Okay, good. Anything else? This is all really good. Those are probably like the 2 main ways that most people imagine a Marxist literary criticism from Marxist literary criticism or a Marxist literature emerging, right? You can kind of push it even further, right? How does it demonstrate class relations, right? We can get into like more minute details in things like this. Or how does it represent a specific moment in history, right? This book was written in 2010, okay, and has, as we brought up last week, very explicit political messaging in it, right? To the point where it's almost not a message, it's just a part of the book, right? It's just there. 2 years prior to this book, something major happened. What happened in 2008? You would have all been alive. I don't know if you would have been necessarily aware of it, but alive, yeah.
Crash in the stock market.
Yeah, another stock market crash happened, right? Almost as big, if not bigger in some senses, than the one in 1929, sorry. So some people might say, hey, it's not a coincidence that Mieville starts talking about these more anti-capitalist ideas in his book right around the time when capitalism seems to be kind of collapsing in on itself. Obviously, it didn't. It's still, around and kicking 20 years on. But the idea kind of remains that maybe that's what he was responding to, right? Whether
It's 2 years before the crash.
2 years after. So
No, the book itself is set.
and yes, exactly.
2006.
Yes, exactly. So he kind of, yeah, you're right.
That's precursor of the crash.
Yeah. So both in the novel, you can kind of read it as a precursor, but also he's writing, prior or afterwards, looking back, right? Yeah. There might be an essay topic in there somewhere, right? Just saying. Which, by the way, before I forget, if I keep rambling on and on, I do want to talk about the essay at the end of the class. So if I forget, just someone remind me, like, hey, you forgot to talk about the final essay or something like that. So just so you know. So all of this can be a very good way of seeing a form of Marxist literary criticism, right? Anything else that we want to add to this? On a more specific level, by the way, when we were talking about material conditions, right, before, for a long time, obviously some of you have this book in digital format, so the materiality of it is perhaps dicey in this sense. But for most of human history, right, we had physical books, right? Well, not most of human history. For a long part of book history, books were physical, right? There's a materiality to this. The way that we produce books matters, right? I was giving the example of religion before, right? And we'll come back to religion, of course, because it's a major part of this book. But, when I was saying that in the feudal times, right, the 13th, 14th century would have been very difficult for someone to claim in his village square that God is dead and, the church is a scam, right? By the time that someone like Martin Luther comes along and says the exact same thing and kicks off the Protestant Reformation that starts modernity, just to simplify that, what changed between feudalism and then? Books are a thing, right? The material conditions of people literally changed, right? They had access to ideas that they never had access to before. Because for most people's lives before then, their entire existence would have been centered around the village and the church. But suddenly, thanks to the invention of this grand thing called a printing press, you suddenly have ideas that can travel between villages, between borders, hell, between countries, much more easily, right? And so you start to see the shift in the way that people actually think about the world, in part, again, you can kind of stretch this to however you feel is best, in part because of the material realities that people actually had access to, right? Does that kind of track for everyone? Okay. Just to kind of, before we move on to part of the religious aspect that I want to bring up, obviously, like I said, there is some criticism that can be had of this idea, right? A lot of the examples that someone like Karl Marx used would have been very focused on Europe, right? That's what he knew, right? That's what he and Engels were aware of. That's what they were looking at, okay? But what's kind of interesting about Marxism specifically is kind of in the same vein as what makes something like feminist literary criticism, which we'll talk about a little bit next week, also interesting, is that it takes on almost a life of its own to a point where it goes way beyond the limitations of its own origins, right? There's a reason why a lot of post-colonial critics that we talked about a few weeks back were also Marxists, right? They saw this set of ideas, right, as being very influential in the world around them, right? A lot of early feminists were also socialists, right? We tend to forget that now, but that's a huge part of the history of feminism. It has gone way beyond its initial idea of just analyzing class struggle, right? people use these ideas to talk about politics. People use these ideas to talk about society, the way our ideas function, right? And so on and so forth, right? Has it always worked out perfectly? Of course not, right? Like Adam brought up, nothing rarely works out exactly as it's supposed to, right? And that's kind of one of the things that I want to put a pin into, right? Is what use does this have in the 21st century, right? In the aftermath of societies actually trying to build themselves around the ideas that Marx and Engels and others put forward, and failing by historical standards, right? For a variety of reasons. We're not a history class. We're not going to get into like why they actually failed or so on and so forth. That doesn't really matter here. But the point is, right, some people tried and by all accounts did not succeed because those countries no longer exist anymore, right? So by that metric, it can be considered on some level a failure. And yet the ideas that are associated to Marxism kind of still hold true to some people today in the 21st century, including our author for today, but also others, right? In India, there's a huge Maoist party, right? It has over 1 million members in it. They're still technically one of the biggest countries in the world, calls itself a Marxist country, right? Or a communist country at the head of the Chinese Communist Party, right? Whether or not it's actually a communist country, you can kind of like have a whole debate about that. And again, it doesn't really matter. But, Cuba is a major example. Again, this one, again, we can have a whole debate about it. That's not related necessarily to literature. But these ideas still permeate in the 21st century, whether we like it or not, right? And I think there is actually a way to relate this to the weird in a way that I think is rather interesting, right? And we will probably come back to that after the break because I see time ticking and I want to like open up one more idea before we take a break, okay? So write that down in your notes just so I don't forget, right? Marxism and weird, why that matters. I'll maybe come back to that. Okay. Who here has seen this quote before? Okay. Probably a very, one of the more popular quotes that's associated with the movement that we're talking about today. And I couldn't help myself but put a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon next to it because I just like Calvin and Hobbes. But Calvin and Hobbes aside, who can tell me what this quote means? What are they trying to get at? By the way, the quote does come from the manifesto as well. Yeah, Adam?
It's like a dependency. Where they use like religion is driven the masses would mean like it's another sort of like addiction to I guess like turn away from the reality of things.
Okay.
I forgot what exactly was the explanation. But logically it would have to be because like opium is a drug that's made like make you hallucinate and like make you like forget about stuff around you and just live in your own world.
Okay.
Religion is kind of the same in a way that it gives you like sort of like firm belief for you yourself to stand on.
Okay.
On just so you have like a base on things.
Uh-huh.
But it's a bit because religion is really like to explain stuff. It's like not an excuse. I wasn't religious, but like to explain things as they are.
Okay. So addictive explanation. Yeah. There's a few things. Liam, you had your hand up?
Yeah. I should say that the opium at the time was the medicament frequently used by the masses during the hard work.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the religion was very, very popular at the time.
Good.
So make like the short raccourci,
Shortcut.
shortcut to religion and opium. That was an escape from people to their reality.
Good. Francesca?
To keep them from realizing their conditions,
Okay.
keep them from an uprising, Like that, like bread and circus, kind of.
Interesting. Bread and circus. So people often associate, that I think most people would imagine it in the lines of what you were just saying, Francesca, the more like ideological smoke and mirrors type of thing. But I think, Liam, you're closer to what the actual intent of this particular quote is. And that's not to say that you're inherently wrong in what you're saying, Francesca. There have been analyses since then that have kind of taken a more ideological strain on religion. But in the context that we're talking about here, the rest of the quote goes like this. And this is what's often more forgotten in the quote, right? Right, so religion is the opium of the masses. It is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of our soulless conditions. Right? So, yes, as Liam, you were pointing out, opium used to be, right, medicine, right? Which I'm sure for anyone who took like a 19th century literature class, it's all over 19th century literature just because it was the medicine by default. So if any 19th century writer brought up medicine, it's probably opium or laudanum, which is opium with alcohol in it, which is obviously the best combination that you can possibly have. But yeah, it used to be the major heal-all, right? From opium, today we get morphine, which obviously we still use today, right? We can also get things like heroin from opium. To the point where at the time, by the way, if a child had a sore throat, you could actually buy heroin lozenges, right? So you could just buy heroin over the counter like you would like an aspirin or anything like that. Yeah, so you could give children heroin in the 1880s. I don't recommend giving your child heroin if ever you do have a child. But yeah, all jokes aside, the point here is exactly what we were talking about before, where what religion to Marx, at the very least, is not necessarily this smoke and mirrors thing. It feels good, right? It's this great thing that makes you, in a way, forget about the world, right? But not necessarily maliciously. It can be malicious, right, for purposes of power. But the concept of religion, right, is one that makes you yearn for a better world, right? The promise of heaven, right, in Judeo-Christian mythology, or the promise of nirvana, for example. I know technically Buddhism is not considered a religion, but whatever, right? So this idea of driving for something greater, right, that escapes the meaningless drudgery of the world that Marx was seeing in the 19th century is exactly what he's getting at, right? But there is a kind of implicit criticism, right, which comes back to what you were saying, Francesca. And that's where the manifesto comes in saying that what we're striving for, when I say we, it's Marx and Engels and the party that they were representing, right? What we're striving for is a world where this is no longer needed, where the average person no longer needs to drug themselves on opium in order to get by, right? And this is something that I think to some extent still holds true today, although we've obviously gone into a more secular direction in our world, right? In our 21st century, people generally tend to believe less in religion, at least in here in North America. But this idea of striving for something greater is still one that I think holds true. And I think that's personally one of the reasons why these ideas, despite the failures that are associated to them, still permeate in many ways. It offers people a kind of opportunity to look for some alternative, right? Try something new, try something other than being exploited for pennies on the dollar by your boss, right? In a sweatshop factory or whatever, right? Okay, so I would keep this in mind, right? This idea or critique of religion. Hint, hint, it's going to come back in our discussion of the book later for obvious reasons. Right? just to kind of bring it all together here. Oh my God, that came out a lot smaller than I expected it to. So just to kind of put a cap on it, there we go. Right. As usual, I'll be putting the PowerPoint up on Studium, so don't worry about like copying this all down real fast. But if we wanted to put this in the form of specific questions, right? This is some of these are things that we've talked about already, right? So the first one, does the work reinforce a certain form of classist ideology? Or even the second question, how might a work of literature be seen as a critique of classism in the ways that it kind of reveals or condemns or counters oppressive forces? This one's kind of an extension of the third one, right? Does the work in some ways support a Marxist agenda, but in other ways support a classist agenda? In other words, is the work ideologically conflicted, right? This is kind of a question that brings up the idea of dialectic that we brought up earlier. And again, might be one that you might think about in relation to this book. I would argue that there is a bit of inner conflict with the book by the very nature of how Mieville writes, right? Or, of course, as one that I brought up earlier, how does the work reflect the conditions of the time that it was written, or the time which it is set, as Adam, you brought up, right? Or how might, as we just mentioned, the work be seen as a critique of organized religion? That is, how does religion function in the text to keep characters from understanding or resisting certain forms of oppression? So this was a speed launch through Marxism and Marxist literary analysis. Does anyone have any questions whatsoever? Like, there is a lot more that we can cover or unpack about this, right? So I'm happy to kind of go through it or answer any questions about anything related to this. Everything was 100% clear. Damn, I'm genuinely surprised with myself. Okay. So with that said, yeah, take a quick break. When we come back, we'll adapt some of these questions and I'll change the formatting so that we can actually see. We'll adapt some of these questions to Kraken itself. And yeah, that'll be pretty much it. I do have, that, and then, okay, future classes. Good. So take a break and see you in a few minutes. Hi.
Are you done correcting the images?
Yes, actually, I have yours. If you want to
Oh, wow. I want to die immediately.
not at all. French. Oh no, she's not here. Okay. I will put Francesca's aside because she is here. Did you also want your midterm? So I might mention, I wrote down the total on another piece of paper and then forgot to actually include the piece of paper in the thing, but it's a very easy calculation to make.
Okay.
But
Okay, then
yes.
this process, yes.
It's just simple addition. Yeah, here you go.
Wait, how much is the one? 30?
Yeah, that would make sense since it's 5, 5, and 50. Yeah, 25. It'd be on 25.
It'd be on 25. Okay.
Yeah, so on 5.
That's
Yeah.
on 5?
Yes.
Okay.
So.
Okay. Cool.
Oh, by the way, not Francesca, Milezi, I got your review. I haven't corrected it yet, but I got it. Oh, and I also corrected your reviews, Aya. I'll send them to you later, but I got your review of the yellow wallpaper and corrected.
Did you get mine by email the first two?
No, I never got them.
Are you sure?
I'm
Certain?
like 99% sure. I don't see where it would be.
Send it from Gmail?
Mm-hmm. I usually check my spam every once in a while, so I don't think it ended up there.
I did write it down and probably should. Okay, I'll send it to you.
No. How long ago did you send it?
I sent it actually the day of our midterm. It was overnight. Or I thought I did. Maybe so.
Francesca, I have your midterm if you want. No worries. Is this big enough if we want to like? Yeah.
Nice comment.
Yeah, it goes one of two ways. Either people find it completely indecipherable or love it. Yeah,
It's giving dot.
it's giving me dog. God damn it. Don't doctors famously write terribly, though?
Well, I think it's pretty. I think it's elegant. But, it's not for everyone.
It's fair.
I've never seen a doctor write well.
I haven't been to the doctor in like 10 years. They might have changed their ways.
Applied for med school, and I was like, your handwriting's too nice. So I don't know if you're gonna get it.
The one friend I had who is in med school has the worst handwriting I ever read. So, the first question I have up here, don't feel obligated to answer it right away, but you can kind of like look through the questions and start thinking through them as I finish off some thoughts. I think the first question does kind of lend itself or lead to one of the questions that I said I would get back to before the break, which is why bring this up in relation to the weird, right? And I think there's actually like a really interesting connection to make on a literary level, right? On both a literary and a social level. How many of you have like been following American politics recently? Yeah, it's kind of hard to avoid, isn't it? It's depressingly hard to avoid in many ways. But if you haven't been following American politics, you do see it a little bit in Canadian politics as well, because we do basically everything, but with like a 6 months delay with the Americans. But you see this especially in conservative politics, where, and this actually applies to you all, right? I say we as if I'm a conservative. No, but where conservatives tend to blame, right, left woke Marxists, right, in the education system for a lot of problems. Has anyone else noticed that? Right? It's like the big buzzword for a lot of conservative politicians is like, oh, the woke Marxists are taking over the university. And I know of only one woke Marxist in at least this university, and it's me. But no, I'm joking. But the idea, right, that this is still something that people are concerned with, right, despite there being a total lack of actual, Marxist or any kind of socialist action here in North America. When I say lack, I mean it does exist, but it's so small that it basically doesn't exist, right? Is kind of fascinating to me, right? And this is kind of where I want to pick up on in the relation to the weird, right? this is a question that some people may or may not know, right? I'll return to the manifesto for a second. Who knows how it begins? Like the very first sentence of the manifesto. It starts with a very, very Gothic sentence. Starts with an S. No, what would be a Gothic creature that starts with an S?
Serpent. Serpent.
No, specter. A specter is haunting Europe. The specter of
Capitalism.
No, communism. The other way around. But you had one of two options, and it was a flip of the coin in this case. So the reason why I'm bringing this up, right, is it's a deliberately Gothic sentence to begin with, right? As a writer, right, which is where the literary connection comes in, Marx was very, very interested in Romanticism and the Gothic, right? Extremely interested. His work is kind of shot through with these literary influences. Capital, the actual book, Das Kapital, is infused with references to vampires and ghosts and ghouls. And some people have even argued that it kind of reflects Dante's Inferno as he gets closer and closer to the heart of the working day, right? Kind of mirrors the way that Dante goes into the heart of hell, right, in Dante's Inferno. There's all kinds of literary allusions in that writing, or in Marx's writing. And what's kind of fascinating, right, is that this specter that was proclaimed as haunting Europe at the time was possibly kind of true, right? It was a moment when a lot of workers were actually organizing into unions. Not 50 years later, there would be a huge revolution in Russia that would actually bring about the Soviet Union, right? Like, this was something that actually did stay on people's minds, right? At the time, it was somewhat of a reality, right? To call this a specter haunting people was not entirely incorrect, right? So on the one level, it's a clever trick of rhetoric. On the other, it's also oddly prescient for the 19th and early 20th century, right? Shockingly, already, even in North America, the Socialist Party at the time garnered something like 2 million votes, right? Which would have obviously today be unheard of, right? So it was, right, a huge moment as far as worker and labor autonomy was concerned, right, and class struggle was concerned. People were actually gravitating towards these ideas. And of course, because of Cold War shenanigans, right, which is my favorite catch-all term for basically the later 19th century, because of Cold War shenanigans, the promises of this movement have kind of fallen into disregard, right? Especially here in North America, where we were considered, and still are considered, right, to be the heart of Western capitalism in many ways, right? We were firmly and actively anti-communist, anti-Marxist in every single way. And we're still living with the consequences of this, right? Positive or negative consequences. I mean consequences in the general term, right? We're still living in the aftermath of the Cold War, despite not being a Cold War, right? There's nothing that we're actually fighting that resembles what we are fighting during the Cold War, or what we were fighting during the Cold War. And this is where I think the connection to the weird comes in, right? We've talked about this before. The weird, contrary to the Gothic, right, is less interested in monsters and more interested in gaps, right? Wedges, right? These things that kind of insert themselves in reality and alter our perceptions of reality. And what I think is interesting to think about, and again, you can agree or disagree with me on this. This is really just a working theory that I'm spouting off as this class keeps going. But I feel like the idea of Marxism has gone from being influenced by the Gothic to being a kind of weird idea to certain groups of people who are opposed to it, right? And what I mean by that is if we come back to the idea, that conservative idea that I was bringing up before, right? We do see it kind of take on the qualities of weirdness. It becomes this thing that no longer really exists in North America, right? And yet infuses the very way that these people understand reality, right? To the point where I'm sure some of you have seen, right? Again, Americans are shutting down the Department of Education, right? Because exactly of their fear of this idea, right? This idea that doesn't exist, this idea that haunts, in the worst type of way, the reality of people in power in the United States. And I say the United States because it's an easy example here, but our own conservative leader here in Canada, Pierre Poilievre, has very similar ideas, right? And you see that kind of rhetoric kind of shine through in kind of shocking ways. I say kind of shocking because I'm not entirely surprised, but it's still disappointing. So I don't know. This is just my way of connecting, right? Why this relates to the topic of the class and how this relates to the topic of the class. Again, this might be a topic for an essay if you really want to think through this. You don't have to respond if you don't have anything to say right now to this idea. You can if you want, but it was just kind of my way of fully bringing it into the purpose of the class, right? And into the view that we're taking in this class. But yeah, I don't know. Do we agree, disagree, not care? Have nothing to add?
I don't know.
You zoned out. Yeah, that's fair. Okay. Anyone else zone out? Most people zoned out. It's all good. You can re-listen to the audio after and just kind of like re-listen to it over and over and over again. So what I want you to do, right? It's currently 10 to 2. As we usually do, I want you to take a few minutes here, and we'll spend the latter part of class kind of thinking through some of these ideas, right? And I'm happy to zoom in on this if you want. And if possible, I know it's a big book to kind of find examples from, but I think it is possible if you've highlighted any parts. Try to find a few examples that we can kind of parse out and think through of this book that answers any of these questions. Okay? And yeah, that's pretty much what we'll do for the latter part of class is kind of go through whatever answers or whatever passages you kind of thought of when thinking of these questions. Okay? And if you have any questions, of course, don't hesitate. One thing I should also mention, if you do want to think about it, why is this not working? There we go. I also do want to give a bit of time to the ending, right? The ending, I think, is probably the hardest part to understand, like what the F actually happened at the end. So I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. And if you want to think about that during the little bit of time that I'm giving you right now, feel free to. That's totally okay. Yeah.
When you mean ending,
Yeah.
do you mean like the ending sequence, like the final thing against
Yeah.
Vardy?
Yeah. Like,
So not like the epilogue.
no, but you can talk about the epilogue if you want, but I think the final like true confrontation is
Yeah.
more interesting to kind of unpack
Yeah.
there. Yeah. Okay. Good. So take a few minutes. If you want to do it in Teams or like chat to people or chat to me, that's fine too. I don't care. Although usually this class hasn't gone into Teams much, but I give you until 2:15. Is that good? Like another 10 minutes or so? Yeah. let's start back. Who wants to go first? Did anyone have any passages that they wanted to highlight that maybe answers some of these questions or goes into an entirely different direction? Bearing in mind, oh yeah, go ahead.
Page 110.
What chapter? 110 page, but she is working with it. Chapter 25? Okay. End of chapter 25, ladies and gentlemen. Almost said ladles and gents. So for the physical copy, the end of chapter 25 would be page 155. Go ahead, Sue.
Split between rebels, the afraid and still obedient slave armies of the loyal. They shattered each other in the fields of the spirit. All confused, none used to the emotions they had credit by some accident of agency. Their capacity to choose their allegiance bewildering.
Still looking for where that is. For some reason. Bewildered. Okay, but while I look for it, why did you choose that particular passage?
You kind of see the social construct that's kind of divided.
Mm-hmm.
You can see the loyals and the people that are the loyals who are still obedient and they're part of the army.
Yeah.
And they're also called the Smith's servants. And then we can see the rebels are described as the murderous fighting, and basically we can kind of see the two classes, and there are the people that are still loyal to whatever that they're taught, and they're kind of called like slaves, and then there's the people who are rebelling, and we kind of see the difference of the classes and how they feel about each other.
This is the part where, oh, okay, there we go, got it. There we go. 152 for where?
It says that they're all confused, and I think they're talking about the slaves of the army. They're calling them confused. They don't know what they're choosing, and it kind of just seems like they're brainwashed.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. Brainwashed by what?
By being loyal to the army, because they don't know what's right from wrong.
So we kind of glossed over this, but whenever from a Marxist perspective, people talk about ideology, right? Usually it's kind of what Sue is talking about here, right? It's the underlying systems of education or state power, right? That encourage a certain way of thinking about the world, right? An easy example in the 21st century is if you wanted to say something like, I think police brutality is terrible and that the police should be defunded, right? Some people would say, no, that's horrible, right? We need the police in order to ensure everyone's safety, right? Even though for a big chunk of society, it just doesn't work like that, right? We know this statistically. And so that would be a kind of ideology at work, right? Where people have a kind of resistance to dismantling what they consider to be an integral part of society, right? And again, like I use these examples, you can agree or disagree. It doesn't really matter in this case, but I'm just using it as an example here. And this whole section of chapter 25 is kind of interesting, where he gives what it basically is a fantasy version of social movements, right? That's kind of what he's doing. Back from the 11th dynasty, he goes all the way back to ancient Egypt and kind of gives a fantasy version of what historical materialism might be of all these class struggles. So yeah, absolutely. And it culminates, I also had a passage highlighted in that same section. For me, it's a few pages later on page 158, still in chapter 25, where Dane is talking to Billy, and he says, history ain't working. Something's coming up. That's what this is about. I bet you can feel it between the statues, right? And what they're what they're talking about is something very interesting, right? This kind of movement of history, this locomotive, if you will, of history, wherein things change and there's simultaneously action, right? We're talking about people uprising or, oh, sorry, this is chapter 26 officially, but still in the same section. But yeah, we're talking about uprisings, but there's still like this underlying force that seems to be pushing people forward, right? History ain't working, something's coming up, right? This something is, of course, you know, an idea that we've talked about many times in this class, that it can be somewhat indescribable what this something is, and is something that as literary scholars you should all perk up when you see, right? Whenever you see the word thing, it usually is a pretty good indicator that you should pay attention. Writers like to use the word thing as a way of confusing people and getting them to think about what exactly they mean by thing, right? Or something. And again, it's not necessarily a conscious thing or an unconscious thing. It's just something that you tend to notice, right? This is especially true in poetry, but not exclusively. Okay, good. There's also, did anyone get a passage out, another passage related to one of the main, well, not main characters, I would say a secondary character that's closely tied to these movements of history? There's like one character that they highlight. He shows up in a few pages here and there, but he's kind of like an agent. Yeah.
Wati.
I'm sorry?
You mean Wati?
Not Wati, although Wati as well. There's a
But you showed up a bit more. Let's few pages.
yeah. I'm not talking about Wati, although we can talk about Wati if you want. He's really fun. Yeah. There's someone we call a chameleon.
Or Joshua? No, Jacob. No.
You're so close. It's with a J. Yeah. Does anyone know? Jason.
Jason.
Jason Smythe. I'm just trying to look for the passage here where he shows up. They call him specifically not just a chameleon, but a. What do they call Jason? It's a special kind of chameleon. He has a prefix. Prefix in front of chameleon. Yeah, a proletarian chameleon, right? What's so special about Jason? Why does he matter? He shows up again a few times. Yeah, go ahead, Adam.
I think he's just a regular dude.
Uh-huh.
He disguises himself. And he's like, he's not, I don't think he's like part of anyone really.
Uh-huh.
He's a handyman.
Yeah.
A regular guy, a proletarian.
A regular guy. He kind of blends in,
Yeah.
right? Why does this matter? Why would just the proletarian guy just kind of blend in and be able to, in this case, act? He kind of what they do. Do people remember what they use him for in the book? Yeah.
I just remember the last page.
Yeah.
That was like it was supposed to like infiltrate a police station.
Yeah.
To like get some info on that, but
yeah, he basically
works like he's from.
Yeah, he basically does some espionage.
Yeah.
Right. Why does this matter? Why would China Miéville have the proletarian character be a chameleon that just kind of blends in and no one notices? Why do we care about that? On a more literary level, why does he only show up a little bit in a book that is so political? It would have been very easy for Miéville to have him be the main character in this case, but he doesn't. Why? That came out much weirder as a why than I intended it to be.
Does he die? No.
I don't think he dies, Jason.
He did, yes.
When does he? Oh, yes, he does die. Yes, yes, he does.
Yes. Kills them in the cell.
Yes, he does. I'm still looking for where he first shows up. I wrote it down and then here we go. Yeah, good. It's not what I had, but good. Yeah, so again, why does this matter?
Because it is related to the cruelty of his dying.
Uh-huh.
I think it is one of the most cruel scene in the novel.
Uh-huh.
In this is that I wonder why it is this kind of practice.
You can come back to that. Like he is very like cruelly dismissed, right? So this kind of does relate to the broader question, like why does he matter at all? If he just shows up to do one little bit of espionage and then later, as you say, he gets cruelly killed, right? Why does this matter? Why is the proletarian character treated like this?
I guess a reflection of how the peasantry, like in general terms, is treated. They're just used for what they are.
Yep.
They're barely acknowledged, and then they're thrown away.
Yeah. So there's that level, absolutely, right? There's the more political level of he's just thrown away to the point where, you know, the novel and the story keeps going, even though, as was just raised, he's just cruelly killed off, right? And yet the story does include him for a reason, right? He is important in some way, shape, or form. So do you have your hand up? Yeah, go ahead.
Jason is a function of the economy. Snack
Yeah.
was a shaped him. He was not specific. He was abstract, not a worker, but a man's shape of wage labor itself. Who could look at that Gorgon in the face?
Good. That's what I was looking for. What page are you on?
Once again, yes, my page is very different from
No.
this.
Okay, what chapter are you on? I'm sure it's later, but
41.
yeah. Okay. Ah, that's where I was at earlier. Damn it. Yeah, okay. Yes. Yes, good. Yeah, so 249 for those of you who are following on the physical copy. Where's Wati? Is he here? Strike duty. Yeah, Jason was a function of the economy. His knack de-shaped him. He was not specific. He was abstract. Not a worker, but a man shape of wage labor itself. Who could look that Gorgon in the face? So whoever saw him could concretize him into their local vernacular, which made him impossible to notice. Who?
It's like a snake person with like hair. It's
Yeah.
just snakes.
Medusa is a Gorgon.
Sort of like
Yeah, Medusa is like the most famous of the quote unquote race of Gorgons. Yeah.
Yeah.
So like this, in this case, it's something, right? That's actually an interesting passage. Who could look that Gorgon in the face? Usually you don't look at a Gorgon in the face, right? You avoid it because you would die, obviously. So again, let's unpack this passage. It's really good. Jason was a function of the economy. And it's something you don't want to look at, right? Integral and yet completely disposable and something you don't want to acknowledge, right? How many of you here, well, actually, I won't ask you, I won't put you all on the spot just because, again, it's less the reality here in North America because we're mostly a country of, or a continent of service workers now rather than like factory workers. But this is something that, to bring it back to the Marxist analysis that we're kind of going for here, is important. And that's why Marx's work at the time that it came out was so important as well. He was one of the first to actually look at these people straight up and actually write books about their condition and explain why economically and socially they were in the position that they were, right? Who could look that Gorgon in the face? Very few people, right? Very few people actually could. But those who do, right? And this is, again, not something that we explicitly talked about, so I wouldn't necessarily expect you to raise it here. Those who do tend to see that they're simultaneously integral, right? And as we're talking about in this passage, abstract. He was abstract. Not a worker, but a man shape, right? This idea, this thing that we just kind of accept as there, and yet for a Marxist like Mieville would be, is what moves history forward, right? In many ways. So he is very important. And he, again, this is something that we didn't have time to touch upon, but one of the criticisms that Marxist criticism, like theory, I should say, has faced is questioning, right, where is the actual agency of people, right? If history just kind of moves forward based on class conflict, right, and material conditions, how does any one person have any kind of value, right? How does any one person actually do anything in their day-to-day life that matters, right? And this is where I think Jason comes in as an interesting character, because he kind of embodies the famous passage that, men and women don't make history alone, right? Which is to say that people actually do participate in the construction of history. There's just a bunch of other factors around it, right? And so if we take this narrative in the more literal sense of telling a story, right, telling a history of a particular moment, Jason is an active participant. He does have agency. He does choose to do certain things. And yet the narrative keeps going, right? There's so many other things at play here that when he does die, it kind of keeps going, influenced by him, but completely oblivious to him at the end of the day. He doesn't show up very often, but again, essay topic idea. You can probably unpack something with that if you really wanted to, right? I wouldn't be surprised, by the way, if people haven't finished this book. You would probably have the easiest time of actually writing an essay about this book, just because we'll never have time to talk about every single thing in this book in class, and I'm not going to try to. But there's a lot that you can individually unpack in each chapter that you can probably have an easy time of writing an essay about something in this book. Okay. What other passages did we highlight or come up with? Yeah, Adam.
I'm not sure exactly, it's near the end, but Paul killing Gotham Zombie.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to find
Yeah, it's which shit. It's that's the best. About the passage about as soon as the Goth dies, 1,000 years of history where everyone was ever tormented by them, felt relief.
Oh, good. I think it
452.
452. Okay. 452. Yes. Good. Does someone want to read that passage? I also highlighted this section. For those of you who are following on digital copies, this is the last few pages of chapter 71. Someone want to read?
The thing that this one?
Yeah, go ahead. So 454. Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Well, it's the whole thing about
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah. And whatever else was happening, in times and places all over, unmentionably many, that going out, the finishedness, ripple was very felt, and every one of London's bullied and terrified were for a meta moment, from 1065 to 2806, all in their own instance and entangled for a blink. In every awful situation, every little room where they were, her head flushed, from screwed, they cried, named, debased, taunted, punched, sneered at, the foe of brutality, for a moment just then, for one instant, which might not save them, but which would at the very least be a tiny comfort for always, felt better, felt joy.
Okay, good. Why does this passage matter? Why did you highlight it, Adam? Or anyone else can pick up on that. Why does this?
I just I know Gotham Zombie are supposed to represent something. I'm not sure what.
Okay.
But it is a deep-rooted fear, a deep-rooted dread that has settled immediately into everybody's minds. Because even throughout the whole story, every time Goth and Zombie are mentioned, they're mentioned with an existential fear that they're back. Goth and fucking Zombie, Goth and fucking Zombie, every single time. They
Yeah.
don't stop.
No, yeah. Even at the beginning of this chapter,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
What is it? Goss and Subby. Oh, not at the beginning, but 448. Goss and Subby. Oh my dear sweet lord. Just okay. So let's unpack that, right? Why we kind of talked about them last week, right? When we talked about how Billy's friend was eaten like an anglerfish. What would we say is the purpose of Goss and Subby here? Like, what do they tend to represent if we want to? And I think you can kind of fit it in perhaps with some of these, but why them specifically would they cause relief? What are they perhaps a metaphor for or a stand-in for? I'm not looking for a specific answer here. I'm just genuinely curious. Why would Nieville have the death of Subby here, or the death of Goss and Subby, be a relief? A sigh, perhaps. A sigh of an oppressed creature, perhaps. Mm-hmm.
I think you can look at like a looming existentiality that has like existed from like ancient. It's like not even ancient, like medieval times. Yeah, medieval times.
Sure. Cool.
So, like yeah, like but wait, the medieval times created the system of like higher. They're not created, but like it like started a real like system of like king and peasants and all that.
I mean, Nieville specifically starts with 1065, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I guess like the death of the deep-rooted hierarchy, hierarchical like unbeatable, unescapable
Dread.
dread and fear and all that. And I also find like I don't understand at all the idea of Subby being God's heart and being just an innocent child. Like I don't really get it.
Yeah, I have a difficulty with that one also.
But another thing I find interesting is that they killed everybody they came across except Marge.
Mm-hmm.
She was the only one, and also like the one prisoner that was with Jason. But because they went specifically after Marge and still left her alive afterwards. That's I don't get it.
So we can kind of. Yeah, this might be a little bit outside of the scope here. Well, let's dial that back a little bit. Throughout the book, you're right. They do kill people, right? For whom, right? What is their actual function in the book, right? What purpose do they serve on a literal basis in the narrative? Like, who do they work for? Why? What's Goss and Subby's function? Yeah.
Hitman for the tattoo.
Okay, good. Here. And again, anyone can answer this here. Like hitman for the
tattoo guy,
right? Which is
Grissan Theo. I don't know what his name.
But like, what does he serve? Like, who is he? What is his purpose? Who's tattooed? We talked about it last week. Like, what does he do? What is Tattoo's purpose? Yeah, let's kind of like work our way back here. Yeah,
his purpose was to get his hands on the Kraken.
Just
to get his hands on it.
Okay.
Like I remember because I read the last 300 pages today because
you're just kind of like grabbed it.
Everything is still in my head fresh.
Okay.
So and like I remember like at some point when Paul is saved from the tattoo and all that.
Yeah.
He says that the tattoo just wants a Kraken because other people want it. So he wants to get his hands on it first, so others don't have it.
Anyone else want to add on to this? Why does tattoo matter to the narrative? Like, yes, there's a power thing. Yeah, go ahead, Minnie.
Was like imprisoned inside Hall's bat 5 years into. Harrison's head is also after the Kraken. So, I'm guessing like he wants to get the Kraken for him.
So there's that game, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, but the problem is that no one knew Gris was still alive. No one knew. This was before. He just wanted it because everybody else wanted it. It wasn't specific to target progress. Yeah.
What does Tattoo want to own? Think of it in the most literal sense that we've talked about before.
Treasure.
What does Tattoo want to own? Not necessarily treasure, although it is a form of treasure, right?
Material condition.
Like he wants to own something for the purpose of power, right? Good. Now, again, with a proper essay, we can kind of like perhaps parse this out in really interesting ways. But in many ways, Goss and Subby are, if we want to make this continued parallel, right? Goss and Subby are the hitmen of capital and property ownership, right? And again, this is like one interpretation. If you want to like offer a different interpretation, that's totally fine as well, right? But on the most basic level, right, Tattoo's purpose in this book is to be someone who owns something for the purpose of power, right? And Goss and Subby help them do that as they have helped people throughout history, right? And that's kind of the point of this last passage. See, we all made it back to that last passage. And everyone in London's bullied and terrified were for a meta moment from 1065 to 2006, all in their own instance and entangled for a blink in every awful situation, every little room, where they were head-flushed, thumb-screwed, decried, named-based, taunted, punched, sneered at, the foil of brutality. For a moment, just then, they felt better and felt joy. What happens in 1065? Why does he start there? In London? History moment? No. It's famous in like British history, but
is it Matt and John?
No, that would come later.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's waiting.
Though another Mad King, however, William the Conqueror comes in, right? Famously barbaric person to come in, and that's kind of where the modern English system establishes itself, is when the French invade, so he decides to start his like moment there in the late 11th century when a conqueror, right, literally William the Conqueror, comes in as this awful person in history and changes, right, the literal structure of British society, right? And he says from that moment, or it's implied that from that moment onward, Goss and Subby are there, right? Being the kind of oppressive system, perhaps, that we're going against. Now, to come back to your other question, Adam, right, of like why certain people are left alive, does anyone have an answer to that? Why are certain people left alive? Go ahead.
Just a guess.
Yeah.
They let the March live because she's connected to Winnie in some way. She doesn't know, but maybe she may know where it is. So that's how they used her.
Yeah, so there's a usefulness to her, right, as alive. Absolutely. Any other reasons why they would be left alive? Yeah. I think that's the more like narrative explanation, and I think it's a very good one. Absolutely. If we want to like keep going on the analysis that we're doing here, there are some interpretations of power, right? But actually, this goes beyond Marxist interpretations of power, so we're going slightly outside of our purview here. But there are some interpretations of power that claim that despite the fact that there is inherent violence in power systems, right? Usually power systems are maintained through standing armies like police or things like that, or the threat of violence. You can't be beating people left, right, and center all the time, right? Like even the most authoritarian countries ever, right, have never done that, right? Let's take the worst people ever to have existed in history. We'll take the Nazis, right? Even then, even they did not kill just literally everyone, right? Because that would defeat you would get too many people against you, right? That being said, they still got everyone against them, rightfully so, because they were Nazis and so they should be stopped. But the point is, right, that even in the worst situations of authoritarianism, right, there has to be some kind of give, right? But again, you can kind of disagree with this interpretation. I can't name off the top of my head anything in the book that might actually support this claim. That's just something that I'm thinking of off the top of my head. And until proven otherwise, we'll go with Carlos's interpretation that, from a narrative standpoint, it makes sense. Okay. Any other passages that were highlighted? Yeah, go ahead, Minhee.
Um, yeah, it's practically an conclusion.
Yeah.
The physical copy for 88 45. It's when the whole thing, like is his whole scheme kind of takes off. And
Yeah.
really tries to stop him.
Yeah.
I thought this was kind of like a critique on religion.
Do you want to read the specific passage? Like, what page are you on specific? 48, 48, 49. So for people who are following at the digital copy, it's at the back end of chapter 78. Yeah, do you want to read the specific passage or anything in particular? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Good. It's not an animal or a god, Billy said. It didn't exist until I curated it. That's my specimen. And then I would even add the next line after, the new rules were being tossed out. Right? We'll come back to that, but why did this passage stand out to you?
Like whole scheme is kind of based on the fact that Kraken was this superior like god, and he was using it to become like this.
Yeah.
To claim power.
To transcend his. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Kind of like breaks that idea and just says that it's just the specimen that he made. It kind of like shattered everything.
Yeah. Good. I would even to emphasize that on the page before, so I'm on 487, so just a few lines up. It's at the bottom of page 487. Billy kind of says that again. It's all metaphor. It's all persuasion, right? It's not a Kraken. The ink god did not hear him until he said it again, and all the attention in the world was amused upon him. It's not a Kraken, and it's not a squid, Billy said. The eyeless thing in the tank held his gaze. Kraken's a Kraken. Nothing to do with us. That's a specimen, right? I know I made it. Good. So kind of tearing it all apart, right? It's literally Nieville pointing at the reader and saying, it's all bullshit, right? It's all nonsense. Stop thinking too hard about it, right? Does it work? Does Billy's claim that it's all bullshit actually work on Gris? Kind of, yeah. So how does this fit in with a wider critique of religion? Let's think through this. Yeah.
I think what he's saying is that religion is taken too seriously at times.
Yes. Okay.
Like in Gris's case, where he became obsessed with even after death, he became obsessed with turning into God's creation, I guess you could say, which is the writing of the Kraken's ink.
Mm-hmm.
And Billy instead became he bottled that thought up, I guess you could say, pun intended, because his goal there was like to, I guess, get rid of the disillusionment
Mhm.
that he's almighty. That thing is exactly what everyone is saying. That's God and all that. When in the end it was just a creature, was a specimen. It was what Billy himself made in people, and everyone else made it what they wanted it to be.
Yeah.
Like,
Good.
like technically, what is the real proof that like it was actually a Kraken from the get-go? They could have just all like convinced themselves that it was.
Mm-hmm.
So, was very cool. Like,
Yeah.
wait to that film.
Yeah. But how do we reconcile that with the fact that there is kind of magic in this world, right? Like, how does Mieville kind of square that circle, so to speak? The fact that there's a literal chapter or part called Londonmancy in which like the city itself can be manipulated and worked through with portals. Is there a way that we can kind of square that circle, that there is magic, but that this religion is bullshit according to the narrative? Like, how do we rectify that? Is it possible to actually rectify it, or is it a contradiction that can't be rectified? Again, I'm not looking for a specific answer here. I'm just wondering if we can think through this a little bit because I think it's interesting. Yeah.
I think it's probably like a contradiction. You can't rectify it per se, and that's not really a need to.
Uh-huh.
Like it's like I find it kind of obvious that it's made to be like an obvious contradiction.
Yeah.
About like everything at the end is bullshit.
Yeah.
No, there's actually still magic in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And all that. But it's just you can't explain everything.
Yeah.
That's really the message I'm finding.
Mm-hmm.
Like even in real life, we can't explain everything. A lot of it is just insinuations.
Yeah. If there's one thing you take away from this class, you can't explain everything. Some things are just bizarre, right? Some things just happen, right? And there's plenty of stuff that we don't know still about the world, right? When we look out into the grand vastness of the cosmos, it's all there, right? We understand that it's like a material reality. There's matter and dark matter and all that fun stuff. But we just don't know sometimes, right? And there is, I think, something to say to add on to what you're saying, Adam, right? The way that the magic works, at the very least, is still a very like material-based magic. It is kind of explained, but it's people actually interacting with things. I'm trying to look for the passage. If anyone has it, that would be great. Where they actually go into the guts of London, right? They specify like the entrails of London at some point. If anyone has that passage, that would be kind of cool. And then I want to keep going on what you said, Minhee, because I think there's still more to be said there.
It's page 197, 198.
197, 198.
I think, yeah. Really, I thought the engine of the city would be stored up under fruits and pipes. When it's supposed to be. That thought will bring up a kind of words of wires, worms, and plumbing fluids, but the literalism of this snack shocked him.
Yeah. The literalism of this knack shocked him, right? The actual things, the material content of the city is a form of entrails. It's a body that can be read, right? If anyone actually is interested in like body politics, again, there's something probably to be done with this book, not just with the reading of the entrails and of the city as this kind of body, but the way that like bodies are treated is also very interesting to consider in this novel. Obviously, there's the animal's body, that's the squid's body in this case, that's kind of treated as this object of desire in the literal sense, but also, there's these bizarre creatures. One of Tattoo's men is like a guy with cameras on him, right? The CCTV, so that you have like this body horror element to it. There's something there. I don't know. I haven't given it enough thought to actually speak about it for any length of time, but I think there's something to be written and thought about there if anyone wants to. And it's something that actually Mieville talks about in other books that he's written. He has a whole trilogy that actually the Space Pirate trilogy that I mentioned last week, the Space Pirate book that I mentioned last week, The Scar, is part of a trilogy of books that takes place in what's called Baslag. And he does play with this kind of bodily element as well if people are interested in that. But yeah, like all that to say, the magic in this world is still very much firmly rooted in reality, right? He poked the mess with his fingers, gentle as a pianist, moving with the fibered tubes, subtly investigating the angles between the loops. It's written in a highly prosaic style, but at the end of the day, he's playing with a series of wires, right? Like, it's the most grounded thing that you could do, especially in the 21st century, right? Okay. One thing that your passage made me think of is page 113, 114 on my copy, start of chapter 19, or at the beginning-ish of chapter 19.
Okay.
113. It's the page where there's a poem on it.
Yeah.
Called The Kraken Wakes. So, in case you were wondering, no, it wasn't random that I brought up Tennyson last week, right? For those of you who didn't pick up on that, Tennyson, of course, is an actual poet. And does anyone remember where we are at this moment in the book, right? Where these poems show up written on the wall?
I think it's like right after Billy gets taken to the Kraken, the Two-Fix hideout.
Yeah, so we're in like the religious center, so to speak, right? Good. Why does it matter in this religious center, or this hideout, right, filled with people who believe that the Kraken is perhaps more than it is? Why does it matter that there are poems and texts all over the wall? Right? Tennyson and a book of poems by Hugh Cook faced each other, open to competing pages. Billy read the counter to Alfred Lord, which is Tennyson. They're not walls filled with that kind of, but why does that matter? By the way, this is an actual poem, right? Hugh Cook is actually a person that wrote this poem that Nieville mentions at the beginning. It's an actual poem that he was able to reprint here. So he's using, right, real world poetry and real world literature and incorporating it into this new mythology that he's making. But why does this matter? Why does the incorporation of literature here matter to the religious element of the book? And you get a kind of sense of it in the next page as well. It fits in with what we were talking about with Minhee. Literature has nothing to do with religion. In the passage that was brought up earlier, I kind of said it was all crap, that it was all metaphor. So why does literature matter? Mm-hmm.
Well, literature is how like a lot of religions have conveyed from history like their meaning, and a lot of it is based off literature, or like just like religious texts, or like the base, like a lot of religious texts, like Christianism and Islam and stuff like that. All of them are based off like holy texts, I guess, like as in a general sense.
Yeah. So there's the literal like level of a holy text, right? For those of you who have read those holy texts, it's all metaphor. No, maybe that's an exaggeration. It's a lot of metaphor, right? And I'm not saying that critically. I think metaphor is very useful and can be an interesting way of understanding things. But that doesn't get us to the heart of why. Why is metaphor so useful here? Why incorporate literature and metaphor into religious practice? And again, if you look on 114 towards the top, you do get a hint at the answer. In one of the italics. Okay. No, it's fine. I'll read it out. I feel like we're slowly zoning out, and that's okay. So at the top of 114, after Apocrypha Tentacula on Worship of Kraken, which is a joke name that this book does not exist, we cannot see the universe, Billy read in a text at random. It was cobbled in an incompetent typeface. We cannot see the universe. We are in the darkness of a trench, a deep cut, dark water, heavier than earth. Presence is lit by our own blood, little biolumes, heroic and pathetic Promethei, too afraid or weak to steal fire, but able still to glow. Gods are among us, and they care nothing and are nothing like us. This is how we are brave. We worship them anyway. I think if there's like one way of understanding how the religious element of the book kind of plays out, it might be here, right? We cannot see the universe, okay? Which is, of course, true, right? We technically cannot see the universe as we understand it, like as a whole, right? We can only ever see part of the universe. But yet, that's not the point. The point is to use metaphor and literature and religion to perhaps help see the universe, right? And I think that's an interesting thought to consider. I had a bunch of other passages that I wanted to bring up, but I see time fly, so we're going to go to the next point here, and this is where we'll kind of finish off our reading of Kraken. Who can tell me what happens at the end of the story, like the big finale? What's the climax? Yeah.
Well, Billy tells Simon to teleport him back to the Darwin Center, which effectively kills them and replaces them with like a copy, I guess you could say.
Yep.
And then he has a final showdown with Vardy. Yeah, with Vardy wants to like erase the entirety of the concept of evolution from history, just so he can give his god, his own god,
Yeah.
like a fighting chance of creation as well.
Much. Yeah. Does he succeed?
No.
Okay. What happens instead? Like there is a bit of an apocalyptic moment.
Yeah. Well, instead he erases himself and the specimen at this point from history.
Okay.
And they just disappear.
How do we do that? How do they erase himself from history itself? Someone perhaps other than Adam. How does this whole function? No, it's, you're right. It's just for variety.
This happens every class.
It's fine.
Not in all my classes.
So how does he actually like erase himself from history? How does this all go down? Hang in there. It's the last question of the day. Are you not answering because we're not sure how it happened, or because we genuinely don't know, or we didn't read it? All of which would be perfectly acceptable, except perhaps not reading it. But
Coffee.
yeah, coffee. Yeah. trying to look for specific passage.
Like 490s.
Yeah, something like that. Eh?
Yeah, chapter 80.
Mm-hmm. What happens at the end? How does it all come crashing down? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, in the end, forgot what exactly like Billy does. It's no. What happens is Vardy sent or threw them all off like the phlogiston time fire thing.
Uh-huh.
The Kraken after having been revived.
Yeah.
This very weird story. And catches them all up in midair and sends it directly to sends it directly into Vardy.
Mm-hmm.
And because actually, yes, no,
Keep going.
no,
Yep.
no. The Kraken, having cut them all up itself, turned back time,
Mm-hmm.
and also all the liquid,
Yeah.
the formalin and the glass and all that, trapped Vardy with it.
Yeah.
And they both burned into nothingness.
Good.
The story was great.
So it does kind of like end on a weird hodgepodge, right? People just kind of blending in with squids and krakens and just kind of exploding into nothingness, right? So there is like a sense of magic, right? Again, to bring it back, there is some form of magic that's happening there. And it just kind of explodes in on itself, right? Now, at the very beginning of the story, right, there is a kind of prophecy, right, that the world would end in fire type of thing. Does the prophecy come true?
No. Well, yes, in a way that the whole story technically didn't happen. It all got erased from history. People remember what happened.
Yep.
But the world itself, it's like a scar. They mentioned at the end, it's like a burned scar that even though it's no longer there, you can still feel it. So the world did end.
Yes, exactly. Right. Like technically, the prophecy did actually happen, right? But not in the way that people expected it. Again, metaphor, right? Ironically, the religious people did not take the metaphor into consideration, right? They took it in the literal sense of like the world's going to be burned, right, and going to kind of reboot from there. And that's not quite what happened. There is a fire on 497. This was a fiery rebooting, uploading new worldware, so to speak. He had remembered Vardy's melancholy, the rage in him, and what Collingswood had once said. She was right. Vardy's tragedy was that his faith had been defeated by the evidence, and he could not stop missing that faith. He was not a creationist, not any longer, not for years, and that was unbearable to him. He could only wish that his erstwhile wrongness had been right. Right? Right, kind of what you were bringing up, Adam, right? So, right, so there is a fiery ball of reboot, right? Which is kind of where my question comes in, right? Is the end of the story more of an apocalypse or more of a revelation? And it's kind of a trick question because the answer is both, right?
It's a reset.
Yeah, it's a revelation for some people, right? Some people, the truth of their prophecy is revealed. But it also is an apocalypse as we understand it in the modern sense, right? There is a literal end of one world and the start of another by the end. But we can even add a third dimension to it. Does anyone remember when we actually did talk about apocalypse and revelation? I think it was like 2 or 3 classes ago. It wasn't last class, and obviously the class before we talked about the
plastic trees.
It might have been for fake plastic trees, actually. Yeah. Do you remember what we said about apocalypse and revelation? Where revelation comes from? literally it means the same thing at its origin, right?
Oh, it's from the
Exactly.
yeah.
So if
The
we
Book of Revelations. Yeah.
if we want to take like Book of Revelation, it's a singular. But yeah, if we want to like bring back the idea of religion and all of that full circle, it's a trick question because technically it means the same thing, right? Revelation in the biblical sense, in the religious sense, means the same thing as apocalypse, right? It just so happens that in the Bible, what that means is like there's actual like demons that come out from the ground and so on and so forth. But it's not the end of the world. It's the revealing of a new form of the world, right? It's the revealing of the truth of the world. At least that's the biblical interpretation. In Kraken's interpretation, it's just that like certain parts of history were like reset, so to speak. Okay. Okay, I've talked for long enough. I'll ask you the same thing that I asked with the first things. Was this a good addition to the syllabus? How many of you say yes, it's kind of a good addition to the syllabus? Like half? Okay. Okay, more than half. And for those of you who say no, why? Milady and Liam specifically, you're the only ones who said no, so why? Oh, you said yes? I didn't see your hand. I'm sorry. Milady, why? I don't, it's fine if not, just why didn't you like it?
Some living rate was complicated. And
Yeah. Yeah.
So weird.
Yeah.
There were so many things with
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. And, again, to reuse that term, I think it's deliberately meant to be like that. And that's not for everyone, right? I totally get that. I say that it's an interesting part of the story is that there's things that are just left untouched upon, right? Things just happen, right? And that's kind of true to real life. Sometimes things just happen, right? But sometimes we don't like that in our fiction, right? We like it to make it all make sense sometimes, which can be, I can understand, a bit disappointing or a bit disconcerting, perhaps. So, okay, good. Probably the next time I talk about China Mieville in a class, it'll be a much shorter book than this. But I'm glad at least people were somewhat on board with it. Of course, this is something that, like I said, you can absolutely talk about in an essay and talk about stuff that we did not address in class, right? Because we simply did not have time. Part of that is my fault because I spend a lot of time rambling, but that's just me. Feel free to absolutely talk about this. Okay, so I wanted to take the last few minutes of class just to talk about the rest of the semester. I should have opened up the syllabus here for a second. Now. Here we go. Ooh, I'm almost out of battery. Okay, so next week we're covering a few short stories. We're going into feminist criticism. I think The Bloody Chamber is perhaps the more interesting one of the two. Although Joanna Russ as a writer is like classic. She's really good. So I would say prioritize The Bloody Chamber if you have to choose one of them. But of course, right, read both if you have time. You should be able to. If you've managed to read all of this, you should be able to read 2 short stories for next week. And I realized that this week I forgot to actually put the nonfiction up on Studium. I'll try to remember it. I'll try to remember it for this week. I'll actually do it right after the class today, in case you do want a more theoretical perspective on this, if you want to read that. But we're entering into the latter half of class, right? And I've had some people send me emails about the final essay and things like that, what the expectations are. My expectations are pretty standard, right, for a final essay. I'll put a grading rubric up on Studium when I have a minute if you want to see it. But it's I expect a pretty standard thing, right? 6 to 8 pages, well-researched, kind of 4 or 5 sources type of thing, okay? And this is something that I do encourage you to do, if you are someone who likes to think about these in advance, right, and puts time and effort into it, I am happy to pre-read your essay, right? Like, as someone who thinks as he writes, I get that sometimes we kind of like just put ideas down and are not sure where they're going exactly, okay? I entirely get that, and I encourage you to do that. Now, actually use me as a resource if you want to run an idea by me or actually show me what you've written so far. Feel free to do that. Okay. You have like a month between now and when the essay is actually due, something like that, a little over a month. If you want to take that time and kind of think through it and talk to me about it, whether in my office or after class or whatever, I'm happy to help. Okay. You're not going to be penalized because you ask me to do, the work properly or to help you do the work properly. With that in mind, I was thinking about the final class, and I'm asking you now because, because it's something that I want to think about. Originally, we're planning. I plan to do Alan Moore and Jason Burrows' Neonomicon, which I'm still down to do. It's a comic book, right? I'm still down to do a graphic novel, but I was not able to order a copy. I still tried to order one, and it's too late now to actually get it in time for the semester. It's been out of print for a while, and I think there was only ever one print run of it, and I didn't realize that when I put it on the syllabus, right? So, I mean, I do have a digital copy, and I'm happy to actually just use a digital copy for all of our stuff. But I did want to offer you alternatives in case it's not something that you were down for, right? Some teachers use the last class as an essay workshop. Does that something that interests anyone? Sometimes, no. Okay, so I see no. One per Aya, yes. Okay. Unfortunately, majority rules. I can't necessarily do that. But again, feel free to come see me and do anything like that. The other alternatives are other things that are more perhaps easily digestible than to read a whole comic book, such as a film. I was thinking of a David Lynch film because that fits in with the actual topic of weird, and we would have time to both watch a movie in class, especially a David Lynch movie, and talk about it after. So that would be another option. Or there is such a thing as weird poetry, but I doubt anyone. Okay, so I'm getting just out of curiosity here. How many of you want to keep the comic book, Neonomicon? Okay, one person. Poetry? Oh, man. Okay, Aya. The movie? Okay, now are you actually going to show up for the movie if I do change things around? Yes, okay. Some people are going to show up. Okay, we're going to watch Eraserhead or something like that for the last class, which if you haven't seen before, hold on to your butts. It's insane. Yeah, if you didn't like this, you're not going to like Eraserhead. It's okay, so good to know. I'll find a copy of that. That being said, I think that's everything I wanted to talk about for today. Just looking at my notes here. Yeah, okay. So I'll highlight this, change the syllabus a little bit later, and yeah, come to me with any questions or concerns or comments, and if there's nothing, I'll see you all next week. Next week will probably be a little bit of a shorter class, just because I need to get to the airport to go to Halifax after, so probably I'll end a little bit earlier. Have a nice week. Yeah. Actually a medical convention. I have no no,